Why don't we go ahead and get started? You gavel.
Yes, Mr. Bond.
We're getting started. Conversations. Let's keep them quiet. Fade out.
I know, that'd be fun.
Okay.
You just need a woman.
So we're going to get started, but before we do, we have a new member to this group, Guillermo. You want to introduce yourself, talk a little about yourself?
Yes, Guillermo Gonzalez. I'll be a board consultant to Supervisor Perez. I have a public policy background, master's from Princeton in public policy. I worked for 10 years for Senator Dianne Feinstein, as her deputy state director, and also the Government Accountability Office.
All right.
Welcome.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Guillermo. So for Guillermo,
Have you met all the other?
wait,
board
should we go around
We
and
go around and introduce ourselves.
why don't we do that?
Go on.
Ruth Ann Taylor-Berger with Mayor Benoit.
Faye Gilchrist, nice to meet you again, General Counsel.
Jill Wynot, Chief Operating Officer. Welcome.
And we met Philip Fine, Deputy Executive Officer for the Planning Division.
Yvonne Zhu, faculty at UCLA, consultant for Supervisor Solis.
Andy Sola, County of San Bernardino, and consultant to Supervisor Rutherford.
Ron Ketchum, cities of San Bernardino, which is Lerma County, so.
Nancy Velasquez, Governing Board Liaison.
All right, information management and production support.
Matt Holder, Councilman Dwight Robinson, who's the city representative for Orange County Cities, is a big force city council member.
Ben Wong, consultant to Michael Caccioli, who represents the Eastern Cities of LA County.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first item on the agenda, as usual, is reviewing the board agenda for next week. And we generally skip to the meaty items, the public hearings that start on page 9. So the first one we'll discuss is item 27. I do realize that a lot of these were not in the packet. These are rules that often are undergoing last minute tweaks all the way up until about this time. So Mike Morris is here. Do you want to give a very brief rundown of what we're doing with 1135?
Certainly. So 1135 is our BARC landing rule for power plants or electricity generating facilities. Most of these facilities are currently in reclaim. Even though they're in reclaim, they were subject to a BARC overlay in 2001 where more than 35 units were repowered or replaced, resulting in 16 tons per day of NOx reduced. However, this didn't include the engines that were on Santa Catalina Island, which I'll talk about in a moment. The rule applies to boilers, turbines, and the diesel engines on Santa Catalina Island. We proposed emission limits for these units that will be effective in January 1st, 2024. There are some units that are not cost effective, and so we've included provisions to address those for low use units and near limit units. We've also included some provisions for the engines on Santa Catalina Island to provide them extra time so that they can explore cleaner technologies. We're basically right now suggesting 8 to 10 years to meet the emission limits for those Santa Catalina engines. We're expecting 1.7 tons per day of NOx reductions from this rule. There are
Sorry, one more time, how much?
1.7 tons per day. There are 3 key issues that we're working on. The first key issue is the Santa Catalina Island timeframe. We've tried to build in the extensions for that and allow them additional time to explore those technologies. You may hear that they're asking for even more time. The second key issue is brought up by some of the stakeholders that aren't directly impacted by the rule. They're basically arguing that the replacement that we are having for Santa Catalina Island engines is outside of the authority of the South Coast, and we disagree and believe that we do have the authority to to ask for replacement as part of this regulatory action. And the last key issue that you might hear is that NSR hasn't been resolved yet, and we shouldn't move forward on rulemaking until that is resolved. We have committed to allow facilities to stay and reclaim until NSR is resolved. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Sorry, Ron,
The question I had before is, what's the actual emissions? Because that's, what do you expect to get, what actual emissions do you expect to get
Sure.
reduced?
So right now, the inventory is 3.5 tons per day of NOx. And we'll be reducing it by 1.7 tons, so the inventory after full implementation would be 1.8 tons.
But currently, based on the last few years, the emissions, NOx emissions are like 1.9. Based on the defined system, based on what they're reporting, it's about 1.9.
Yes, so when we're looking at the emissions for the rural development, we're using what they're permitted at, multiplied by their fuel usage. So that's how we
I guess
determine.
what I'm asking is, what do you expect to be the actual emission reductions?
So Ron, this is how we have to calculate emission reductions. We have an
No,
obligation.
I understand that.
Under,
I understand that,
Yeah, okay.
but I just am curious, for what you actually expect to get.
well, remember, a lot of these facilities are already at BART. So some actual emissions, it varies year to year because all these facilities are power plants. They do not run 24/7. There's a lot of peaker plants, not as much base load. So it really depends year to year. But for reclaim purposes and achieving that 12 tons a day that was committed to, this 1.7 goes towards that. It's the same calculation. I understand actuals can vary year to year, but because a lot of this equipment is already at BART, that number is going to be a little bit smaller on the actual side. But we get SIP credit for it.
Actually, if we look at the last few years, it bounced from about 2.2 down to about 1.7, 1.8. So it looks like a fairly consistent level right now.
Yeah, and what I was going to say is among the facilities affected by this rule, we don't have opposition. Edison, who runs the facility on Catalina Island, we've been working with to try to give them space to come up with a more renewable solution than just replacing their really old diesel with cleaner diesel. We don't want to force them into that on our timeline, so we're giving them a little space to try to explore that. It's much more expensive to make that conversion. If they have to do that at the end of the day, they'll have to do that, and that actually gives us some emission reductions there. But we're hoping that they find a way to do something a little more interesting on the island. It's a difficult problem on the island, obviously.
What's the capacity of their generation? I mean, how many megawatts is?
9.
9.
It's very small in terms of overall basin generation, as you can imagine, but it's larger percentage-wise in terms of emissions, because everyone else is very clean and they're still running some diesel.
So you mentioned before that these facilities are all in reclaim and already at BART. So are there additional controls they're going to have to put on pieces of equipment?
There's a few pieces of equipment that will require, controls or replacement, but most are at BART, right?
Yeah, there are several notable exceptions. The city of Glendale and the Catalina Island engines, where they found in the past that it wasn't cost effective. And now we're seeing that it is cost effective, and so we will get real emission reductions from those two facilities.
Yes.
Can you review the issue of the authority of AQMD to implement this?
Yeah, so the comment we've received and responded to is that state law gives us not just authority, but a mandate to implement best available retrofit control technology. And a comment has been made by industry to say that word retrofit does not allow us to require to be able to move forward with a rule that is based on a cost effectiveness calculation that is based on replacement. That's the argument. They're focusing on the word retrofit in statute and interpreting it very narrowly not to include replacement. And we've responded to that, and we put it on our website. We gave a legal response to that. It's on our Reclaim webpage. There's lots of reasons we disagree with that, and you could look at that memo.
The specific statutory language says that barked is an emission limitation that is based on the maximum degree of reduction achievable, taking into account environmental, energy, and emission limits into consideration of by each class or category of source. So in other words, environmental, energy, and economic impacts, and those are all things that we are considering as part of our BART analysis. So we think we're on firm line.
If I can make a comment on that, when that provision was put in the health and safety code, identifying what BART was, at the time, the act was more equivalent to federal layer, and you know, in the 90s it was changed, but actually it used to be more stringent. And the idea was, because the district hadn't identified any way that the standards could be met, the legislature said, okay, well, some of the public said, you should go ahead and have all stationary sources put in backed. So essentially backed retrofit. And the specific provision was changed, recognizing that when you do a retrofit, there are certain things you need to take into consideration that wouldn't be applicable when a new source was put in. So the idea was always that you were going to get that most stringent emission limitation given the physical or other limitations at a particular place. Just a little bit of history.
Yeah, we don't need to go into details now. I think everyone could look at that memo for our response there. I mean, I could go on for an hour about why we disagree with that interpretation, but and the absurd implications that come out of that interpretation. So, any other questions on 1135?
Kind of an off-the-wall tangential question. Sorry about this. Like Mountain View and Redlands, it's really, really clean, but it pumps out a bunch of GHGs. Are GHGs on the horizon for this agency?
Well, I mean, they are for some of the other local districts because they have the fortunate designation of attainment for a lot of the air quality standards. Our primary focus has been, you know, meeting the NACs, and now, you know, looking at community air quality under AB 617. But we've adopted some energy policies and climate policies. Our board has adopted those in the past that have always put air quality first, but have laid out a series of actions and objectives on climate. We're actually been talking to Wayne about it. We're thinking of revisiting that. We're thinking of making the climate committee of the board a little more active. So we're exploring ways in which we can do that. One of the connections presented at Mobile Source last week is how climate change might be affecting our ability to actually attain the standards through potential weather pattern changes. So we're looking at seeing how we can get more involved in that space. Any other questions on 1135? Okay, 1407.1. Did Susan or Mike, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So 1407.1 is our proposed rule to begin addressing emissions from metal melting operations of chromium alloys. Right now, we have rules for non-ferrous metal melting and then lead operations, metal melting. But we have a source test and we have other results from heat treating and other related industries that show conversion of chromium to hexavalent chromium during metal melting operations. And so we're trying to develop this rule to begin addressing a regulatory gap. What we normally do when we have a situation like this is we go out to facilities and do source testing with them to start establishing what appropriate controls will be. However, our offers to do the source testing at these 14 facilities has been declined. And so we've come forward with this proposed rule to begin this information gathering operation where we'll be requiring a source test from 8 of the facilities that have controls, and then information gathering through surveys and metal composition testing for all 14 facilities. The expected cost of these facilities ranges for the ones that don't have to do the source test between $3,000 to $7,000 at a one-time cost. For the ones that are required to do the source test, it would be $30,000 to $40,000 one-time cost. We are still offering to do the testing for 3 of the facilities, so if there's some type of financial impact, we're providing that at no cost to them. We're hoping that with that we can develop the information that we need to have another rule in the future that will actually address and limit the hexavalent chrome emissions from these types of facilities. The industry has come back to us and recommended that we table the rule and instead do the testing at Cal Poly Pomona. We are in the midst of initiating a contract with Cal Poly Pomona. There are some logistical issues delaying the beginning of that contract. But even if we were to get that information, it'd be great supplemental information, but it's not enough information for us to go forward and develop these appropriate controls. We need testing within these facilities because they're much larger, much more diverse. There's a lot of different operations that can't be easily replicated on a university laboratory type setting. Additionally, the industry has said that the test method that we're using, CARB method 425, isn't appropriate. The method is in fact appropriate for any type of stationary source operations, including metal melting operations where it's been used by our district and other districts in the past. They have yet to provide any evidence that this test method is not appropriate. And with that, if you have any questions.
I have one question. At the Stationary Source Committee, staff indicated that they might look at alternative ways of spreading around the budget that the district had made available for some of the testing and might come back with some changes. And are things pretty much as they were at that point?
Yes, we did contact all of the facilities and once again make that offer to do the testing for free in case there was a cost issue, and again they declined. So we've stayed basically with the same proposal that we had all along.
We even offered to do the testing and to keep the test anonymous, because that was one of their concerns is the information about that particular facility, and the public would be concerned about it. So we were able to work with legal, and we could do that type of source test, and they still weren't comfortable with that. And some of the facilities are going ahead and starting to do their own source test. So it's, they're interested in finding out what the issue is themselves, but they're not comfortable with us doing the source test. So we are pursuing with Cal Poly, but that won't give us all of the information that we need.
Okay, I was, I attended a lot of those working group meetings, and I was extremely impressed by the sensitivity toward the needs of the industry and the adjustments that staff made in trying to collect this information and the care that staff took on that. So I thought it was a real impressive job, but there's only, you need that information in order to go forward. Yeah.
The industry has said it at committee that we have no evidence that there's a problem, and that's just not true. We have evidence there's a problem. We don't have enough evidence to move forward with a rulemaking that requires controls yet, but that's why we're doing this, to get that information, to see whether we need to move forward with a rule that requires controls.
Is there a reason why they insist that Cal Poly do the testing?
Well, their stated reason is that they want to do it in a controlled environment. They want to be able to try to test some things that might avoid the conversion to hexchrome from chromium. We think there's a little bit of a delay tactic there that they just want to put off. Because we're going to have to come back and do source testing at some point anyway in the future in order to do the rulemaking. We need emissions data, we need that. And our other point is that this is a very small furnace at Cal Poly. You might be able to test the melting process or maybe the solidifying process, but you're not going to test all the things that happen at a large facility that's pouring and transporting and cooling and all the things that happen. There's just no way to replicate that in that.
Hasn't Cal Poly done a lot of work with them too?
Yeah. The other thing is Cal Poly has done work for them before, and they recommended Cal Poly, and there's some concerns about independence. We're trying to work that out. But we are moving forward with a small study with Cal Poly to see what we can learn, but we don't want to delay getting the information. We wouldn't have had to propose this rule at all if when we wanted to go test at their facilities over the last 18 months, year, they just would have, like most facilities will work with us and allow us on site to do our own source test and get that information. They've pretty much refused.
I think just as an example of how contentious proposed amendment rule 1469 is, we did testing at those facilities too. So just as an example, it's not a one-off that we do this. We've done it 1156. There's a whole slew of rules where when we don't have that specific information from the facility on emissions data, that we go out and we work with the facilities and source test.
Based on their emissions that they report to us, can you not select one or two what you consider have the greatest potential to be a problem neighborhood and do some specialized air monitoring to see exactly what kind of...
That's all we want to do. So, but 8 is already a pretty small number from the whole universe. We selected the ones that have already have control equipment because it's easier to source. It's cheaper to source test them because they already have the ductwork. So we've already narrowed that down, and we've offered to do it ourselves for the first come, first serve for 3. But go ahead, Mike.
But could you just do some air monitoring? Do you have to get their permission to do air monitoring?
So your ambient air monitoring, is that what you're?
Yes.
Well, we did that in Paramount, and then it led to identification of facilities, which then we had to go in and require testing. So it's easier to do the test at the source to see if that is putting out these emissions. If you do it in the ambient, there's sighting issues, there's distance issues. They always say the wind switched that day, so it's more direct to do it at the facility. We do ambient air monitoring for a lot of reasons when it's appropriate, but that would be sort of a second or third level of trying to identify the issue.
We already have a source test from the past that suggests it's a problem. So we've already skipped that ambient monitoring point. So.
What kind of products do these guys make?
Generally, it's stainless steel castings, and so they they tend to be aerospace or energy related. They're or automotive products, but higher end.
This is part of part of the findings of Paramount wasn't just that we had some problems with the platers, is that there's a lot of processes out there that have chrome containing alloys like stainless steel or others that no one was aware that conversion can occur to hexchrome. I mean, there's still a lot of investigation that needs to be done, and this is just part of that in one sector, but there's other sectors we need to look at too.
What's the theory of how that conversion to hexchrome happens? What are the conditions that are present that creates that?
Yeah, I think it's so the conversion is an oxidation state of chrome, so at high temperatures, and if there's an oxidizer there, I think that's what we're seeing. But I don't know if Mike or Susan want to.
Yeah, that's
And
correct.
so we saw the conversion for metal melting, for metal heat treating, which is at a lower temperature than melting. So we already know the conversion occurs when you're doing heat treating, and the temperatures for metal melting are even higher. So we have the source test to confirm, and then knowing just the science of the oxidation that you'll see, probably even more that will be converting. And then we also see it in welding, which is even higher temperatures. So the evidence is there.
Isn't the source test or the test that you have pretty old.
The
that was
method?
done. Well, you said you had
Oh, the one piece, the
evidence
one
for
source
that-
test.
Right, it's pretty.
It is all in 1993.
Yeah, was it the same, was it done using the same test method?
Same
or-
test method.
Okay.
The method has been updated since then, but only to provide greater
Better,
accuracy.
okay, all right, thank you.
Any other questions on 1407.1? We expect there'll be testimony on that. Okay, 1469, I'll let Susan, what, is it okay? Yeah,
So we're good to go. No.
Yeah.
Once again, we're gonna be bringing 1469 back to the board, and there's two changes that we've made since the September hearing. One was to change the distance for openings that are near sensitive receptors, so aligning it with the school, so it'll be 1,000 feet. The second change is to add a provision for small low-use tanks that we went back to, the metal finishers had asked for special provisions for those types of tanks. And we went back to look at the calculations, and the emissions from those small tanks, if they cover them and their use is no more than 2.5 hours per week, that they meet the same emission limit that would be required for the controlled tier 3, the high emitting tanks. So we did meet with the metal finishers. There were 3 requests that they had. The first request was a provision that we had already had in the September version of the rule. Second was the small use, low use tanks. The third request was to open up the ban for tier 2 tanks. We went over the provision for tier 2 tanks, and there's the option for them to test out of a tier 3 to bump down to a tier 2. So then reminding them about that provision, they were comfortable with that tier 2. So at the Stationary Resource Committee, they felt that they were not gonna in the position to oppose it anymore. However, they're still concerned about the costs of the rule. So presentation will focus, a little bit more on the cost, and very similar to the Stationary Resource presentation. Community groups still have the concern for the use of PFAS. The rule has the schedule for reevaluating PFAS, the chemical fume suppressants that are currently used. We can't just remove a provision for use of the fume suppressants. It is the sole control for some of the smaller facilities. It's a 99% control efficiency for hexavalent chrome. You remove that, then you have no control on those tanks. We want to do our due diligence in regards to the fume suppressants and look at other options before we say that you can't use them. So we're working on that. There's options if we do decide that we're not going to allow the use of fume suppressants. One option is that we're going to be looking at other low-cost options that we can certify that would relieve facilities from having to do their homework on finding these other technologies, and also doing repeated periodic source tests. And then we're also going to be looking for funding if we decide that we need to ban it. So that wouldn't come till the 2020 timeframe.
Does that come from OEHA or EPA, the decision on fume suppressants?
Yeah, we'll make the decision with CARB and OEHA. We'll work with them
So it's
together.
state, not?
It'll be in our rule. The state is working on the ATCM, and we've been working very closely on the discussion of the fume suppressant. So I think it's if we decide to do it for 1469, I wouldn't be surprised if it's echoed in the ATCM. So that's kind of been the process in the past.
EPA's held 1 or 2 meetings, but we don't expect any action from EPA in the near future.
Some stories about this stuff in water. Is that the same family that I would heard stories in the past month or so about?
Yep. So the PFAS, PFOS, PFOA, PFEX is all in the same family tree. It's primarily used for firefighting as a foam suppressant. And so when they use it for wildfires and things like that, then the runoff and going into waters and streams and drinking supplies and things like that is a concern. It's bioaccumulative. In terms of an industrial use, the use of it is far smaller than when you're talking about as a firefighting type of foam. But the concern has primarily been on the water quality, water side. But we're gonna be looking at it holistically, from air and then also in terms of their use and as it's being released into wastewater and things like that.
Is there a difference on the health effect? Because like hexchrome, airborne, it's definitely bad for you in the water. It's a little more debatable.
Yeah.
Less bad.
The inhalation pathway is the one we focus on, and is the one that has that really high cancer risk. I can't speak to the water exposure pathway, which I know can be bad too, but it's
Well, I
very,
mean the
very
PFAS and PFAS. I'm just using
Yeah.
hexchrome as an example.
Yeah.
In water, is it
It's-
definitely
it's a
worse for
known-
you than airborne?
So we need to look at that. There's evidence, there's obviously a lot of evidence that in water, it's bioaccumulative and has effects on ecosystems and potentially people, but there's no information on it even getting airborne, much less what would happen if you did have an inhalation. But we need to look at that with OEHA what the rule says is that we're giving ourselves 18-month deadline, essentially, that if we can't recertify it as safe, then it has to go. And but we're going to do that work in the interim to find alternatives and see what we can do. But the facilities that use it now, it was a replacement for another PFAS compound, PFOS, the EPA banned. So now they have to use this alternative, which is in the same family. But when they use it, they're not dumping it into the street. They have wastewater treatment systems at these facilities before they can put it in the sewer system. So they're heavily regulated. This pathway hasn't really been explored as much as the general water pathways.
Just something regarding the sensitive receptor change, and I got some very positive feedback from community groups about that change. But there seems to be some confusion about whether or not parks are considered sensitive receptors, and I know that in was it 1466, we had a definition of sensitive receptor that was supposed to be the model that included the sensitive receptors, but the community is concerned about parks maybe, or at least those definitions not matching 1466.
Yeah, I think in 1466, we did not change the definition of sensory receptor to include parks, but we did include parks in terms of athletic fields that schools use that are at parks, or they have some type of, adjacent, or they have contracts with the parks to use them for certain types of activities for school kids. And that was for when they're doing earth-moving activities that contain toxic materials, that we didn't want them to be doing those certain types of activities when the kids were present or during certain times when the fields would be used. We did consult with OEHA in regards to the definition of sensitive receptor and parks, and it was something that has been discussed at the state level in terms of parks and should it be included in the definition of sensitive receptor. And the discussion with OEHA is that in identifying particular sources that would be included in the definition of sensitive receptor, that they use kind of a two-prong approach. One being that the predictability of people visiting that particular location. So, and then the other is the duration that somebody would be there. So schools meet the definition of sensitive receptor because it's predictable that there's a certain schedule that they'll be going, the kids will be attending school, although it's not, it'll be maybe for a shorter duration, it's not a lifetime type of duration, but it could be. And then for hospitals, it's not predictable, but then somebody could be there in a care facility for a fairly long duration. So parks, it wasn't predictable, nor was it something that was long-term. When we look at residential receptors, if you are assuming that somebody in the community is living near that park, the assumption is that in the health risk analysis is that you're assuming that that person is outside. So that person, although they're not always at their resident, but we would be calculating some exposure assumption for them. And then so even though we didn't look at the park, I think there's some estimate for that particular resident that would be in that general area. So.
I think the other difference between 1466 is like it's relatively shorter term exposure. You're moving dirt for maybe 6 months maximum, but hexchrome is a long-term pollutant. You're already assuming 24/7 exposure over 40 years for a resident, and it's hard to correlate that to somebody visiting in a park, even if it's 2 hours a day, a few days a week, right?
Yeah, I just question whether that length of exposure for somebody is really appropriate for determining what a sensitive receptor is. You know, risk assessment is about relative risk, and if you're being exposed to something that's toxic, you want to avoid that. And if there are going to be, I mean, you assume that a park is going to be used all the time that it's open. So that risk is going to be occurring to some population. It may not be the same one, just like for any house. It's unlikely that somebody is going to be in that house for 70 years or for 35 years, but you still look at it that way as a sensitive receptor, no matter who's there.
So that level of conservatism and those assumptions is already built in. This would be taking that another level to include parks. And then there's a question of what parks, because it's very different if it's a corner park with a playground that's small, but then you have some very large parks which like 2/3 of the park may be, a nature reserve where nobody can go. So there's a lot of different things that would have to be worked out. We've committed to continue to work with OEHA on this, but
I think it's a less conservative assumption because it's kind of an artificial exclusion of a place where you know that that kids are going to be playing. It's like at the Exide community, you have those little islands where there was a lot of controversy over whether those are going to have the lead cleaned up. Well, kids are only there for a certain amount of time playing on those things, but you still want to clean it up because that exposure is there. Anyway, there was some confusion over how the definition was there, and I think you cleared it up.
okay. Any other questions on 1469? I think hopefully this is finally.
I just wanted to
Last
comment
minute.
that I thought the presentation was outstanding, that having that slide about the cost breakdown and where those categories fit rather than it being generic, showing that health risk of being astronomical on the charts versus it's really bad for you. And I thought that was very helpful in putting that perspective back into the rule. Sometimes we don't see the forest through the trees. And thank you for making those changes. I think I thought it was outstanding.
Good.
So did my boss, by the way, not just me.
That was a great slide presentation.
It was excellent, yeah. The chairman was very happy with it.
Yay.
Yay.
Okay. Any other questions on item 29, 1469? Okay, item 30, just real briefly, I think most of you have been briefed on this, or your bosses have. This is essentially a mostly administrative SIP update to the 2016 AQMP, included several standards we were submitting to update the SIP. Because of the timing of the AQMP, the 1 hour ozone standard, the analysis that went into that didn't include the final inventory that came out the next month that was used to do the PM and the 8 hour ozone standards. So even at the time, we knew we were going to have to do this update to kind of bring those inventories together. There were minor changes to the inventory. So what this does is essentially updates what we submitted at the time. It does not change any of the commitments made by CARB or us. It does show that we still attain the standard by 2022 with the measures as proposed. It does state that the new inventory and the new modeling requires a little bit less to get there, but we did not remove the commitment to get the full amount that we committed to in 2016. So happy to answer any questions on that. We should have no real impact on our strategy.
I'm really confused now. And last month, we talked about this a little bit, and staff indicated that there was an issue with CARB and their strategies, and you were removing their control measures out.
We weren't removing the control measures. All we're stating is that we no longer need those measures earlier. They have the commitment in 2023 to achieve a certain amount of emission reductions. And for the 2022 standard, what we said is we know they're not all going to occur in 2023. Some of it will have to occur previously. So we gave it a little bit of a conservative proration to get to 2022. Those commitments are still there, but all that's changing is the underlying analysis. The result of that analysis was that even though we had a set amount of emission reductions we needed from CARB to get to 2022, the new analysis doesn't require that. It doesn't mean we're not maintaining the commitment. If, assuming EPA approves the 2016 AQMP, that commitment will still be there. So we're careful not to say we need less, therefore we're going to do less, because we know the challenge in 2023 is the greater one, and we all got to work towards that no matter what.
Okay, that makes sense to me, except on the summary, it says no longer includes emission reductions from CARB.
The attainment demonstration doesn't. In the modeling.
Okay.
Didn't need that. It doesn't mean the commitments are being removed.
Okay, so they're still gonna have to go ahead with those particular items,
Yeah.
but the time frame has just changed.
Uh,
Because it'll be after the 2022 to 2023.
We did not remove, well, you guys could weigh in. I don't believe we removed the commitments for what we assumed would have happened in 2022.
Okay,
But if those don't occur, we still attain the standard. The attainment demonstration says we could, but we did not want to change their commitments or our commitments.
okay, great, that's really helpful, thanks.
One little question. If we don't meet that deadline, is there any repercussions coming on us? Because it's not a standard, it's not.
It is a standard. It's a revoked standard. There's
It's a standard, it's revoked.
It's a revoked standard, but there's a lot of EPA regulations about anti-backsliding. So if EPA approves this, what would happen with the 2022 1-hour ozone standard is 3 years prior, if we were relying on 182E5 black box measures, we would have to basically fill that black box. This attainment demonstration does not rely on that. So if this gets approved, the next, we have to show reasonable further progress and all the other SIP requirements, but if this gets approved, then until 2022, that's when we should attain the standard, assuming we meet all our emission reduction commitments. If we don't attain by 2022, it kicks in a different part of the Clean Air Act that kicks in certain sanctions, Section 185 and other things, and then a call for a new SIP to show how you're going to meet that standard. That already happened once on the 1-hour ozone standard, so hopefully it doesn't happen
We're
again.
supposed to meet this in 2000, I think.
2010.
And then 2010,
2010.
now it's 2022.
It was actually 1982.
Oh, it's 1982. And all we need is 1 year like last year, where I think we had 25, 27 days exceeding standard.
We're finally going to do it. Just 1 hour doesn't have that many exceedances, so 1 hour we're closer. So
Last year,
we have 11, I think, exceedances. So,
last year was 25 or 27 days.
but this year was only 11, I believe.
Yeah, 10 or 11.
Last year was a bad year. This year wasn't a great year. Our design value's about 135 now. Well, maybe next year, if the normal year, could be close to that. But we think we can get there with the emission reductions that are in the pipeline.
The fabulous thing to me is that this is really fabulous. The
Really, I do.
1982 AQMP said in the early air quality will get better until the early 1990s, and then it will get worse because of growth, and we can never ever expect to meet the standard. So this is like phenomenal, exciting news. That
Better late than never is what you said.
I'm saying it's fabulous that it's happening.
It's happened in his lifetime.
Yeah.
Mark being optimistic.
Climate willing.
Well, we did have only 5 days of exceedances about 4 years ago, so gone up. And maybe we'll
Yeah.
go back down.
What's the 1 hour standard, 80?
No, this is 120 ppb.
Oh,
So we need to get to 124. Right now, we get a couple like 140s every year, but it's really the second highest. It's better metric, so that's in the 130s. So it's not, it's in the cards. I can't promise. We never know for sure. But we've already, through the fundraising we've done and with the incentive programs, we've got locked into place. No, we're already going to go beyond what we had in the attainment demonstration for this standard. We're going to
Did
get
you
more.
know that by saying that you cannot retire until we meet that standard?
Or I'll have to retire if we don't meet the standard.
It's like, are we gonna get to the playoffs or not? Oh, yeah, that's just gone.
It's covered up.
We're on page 2.
Okay, I took care of the public hearings, so we'll go back to the beginning of the board calendar. Page 2. Some minutes, which you don't have, but no comments on that. We have 2 set hearings. 1118.1 is the first one. I'll just real briefly mention that, we have kind of 2 outstanding issues that we heard at Stationary Source Committee. We're working hard this week, early next week, to resolve those. We're optimistic that we can. We added a public consultation group meeting on Tuesday at 1 o'clock next week to go over any potential changes. So we're trying to get all that together so our 30-day package includes the changes that we're looking at right now. Trying to address the concerns of the publicly owned treatment works. Also, you heard the concerns of oil and gas and flaring. So we're looking at how we can resolve those and reach consensus.
What about the public concerns that were raised
On the oil and gas,
on the 1118?
you're talking about Michael Salmon?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're trying to look at that as well. We have some ideas. We're having those discussions this week.
Okay, good.
I'm not sure we can get there in the time allotted, but we have some ideas that hopefully can.
Okay.
Any questions on that? This rule it's about 0.2 tons per day of emission reductions, which sounds small, but when you look at the universe of stationary sources, it's not that small. Plus, it will avoid emission increases in the future, because a lot of these flares are existing flares are unregulated. So if there were increases in activity at oil and gas sites or publicly owned treatment works, which we know could happen, this will at least keep things steady instead of leading to increases. Okay, if there's no questions on that,
Are you expecting testimony? Is this now that
depends what happens in the
there
next,
is on death row?
depends what happens in the next like 5 days.
Okay.
There'll be testimony, but the question is, what is it going to be?
Okay.
And Phil, we're also hoping to take this back to the stationary source next month.
We'll come back to stationary as well.
Just one more question. The recent issue that got raised about ammonia formation. Does staff agree with the concern of LA County?
It could be a problem. We don't have enough now to know for sure it's a problem, but we're coming up with a compromise that will lead to a pathway that will examine that issue and not affect those types of issues with the adoption of the rule. So essentially what we might be doing is saying, if you, all you have to do is comply with BACT if you're at publicly owned treatment works. We can't exclude you from BACT requirements in a rule. So you still have your BACT requirements as they exist and a commitment to kind of revisit all that, given the potential increase in ammonia. But no one's done the analysis to know whether an ammonia scrubber can solve the problem, and so we need to go through that. We need to go through that process. It's way too premature.
Do you think it's possible to pull out the ammonia and make beneficial use of it?
Of the ammonia? I haven't thought about that.
Split off the hydrogen?
Something we could look at. It's still in pretty low concentration, so we'd have to see if you can get enough out of there. But But we think there's some technological solutions that would avoid this happening. And the other thing we brought up is that one of the reasons we want to treat the publicly owned treatment works differently is they have gas no matter what. They can't shut down their operations. So that's different than an oil and gas site, that if something goes horribly wrong, they can actually shut down. But for the issue that they brought up, which is increased food waste going to the digesters, if you have this food waste stream coming in and you're just flaring it, that's not the intent of having the food waste go to the digesters. So if that goes on for a long period of time, like there should be some mechanism to divert that elsewhere, right? So it's kind of a little bit of a different issue, but I think we've come up with a way within the rule and resolution language to set in motion a way to resolve it. Any other questions on that? So 1146. That's my name on it for some reason.
So 1146 is it's a series of rules. 1146, 1146.1, 1146.2 applies to boilers, heaters, process heaters, external combustion units. This is a landing rule for the reclaim facilities. We went back and did a BARC analysis, and so we're lowering the NOx limit for a number of categories. It'll apply to reclaim and non-reclaim facilities. Total reductions that we're going to get is about 0.27 tons per day. The implementation time frame is they have to make 75% of based on their BTU, their heat input, 75% reduction by January 1, 2021, and then the remaining units by January 1, 2022. We give them an extra year if they decide they want to replace their unit instead of retrofitting their burner, replacing their burner.
And as was discussed at stationary, there are still some concerns from the landfills. So we are looking at kind of bifurcating and either not changing the limits for them right now, and then looking towards another sector-specific rule in the future, maybe one for digesters and POTWs and another one for landfills, because there are some unique situations going forward that we think we can handle better holistically rather than as a kind of a very small subset of all these other combustion rules.
Can't the landfills meet the proposed standard by using the NOx Tech technology? Because I know that there's been a unit operating up north someplace that's been there for years.
I think their comment back in regards to looking at some of the other units is that their unit is larger and that there's some uniqueness in regards to the burner, and that it requires a specialty burner working with the manufacturer. So I think what we would like to do is I feel like we're kind of rushing on the landfill issue, and so if we have more time, instead of going from 25 to 20 ppm, maybe with a little more time working with them and understanding their issue, looking at other options, maybe we can actually get more reductions. Might take a little longer, but it might be something that will be beneficial, and then something that will be more palatable to them also.
I think the NOx Tech is doing 11 or 12, if I recall.
Yeah, for the landfill gas, for those units, we're pushing it from 25 to 20. So it'd be nice to see, if we can get them even lower. But they do have unique challenges, and so.
Right.
One of them being they're not going to be there very, the landfill gas keeps reducing in quality, and at some point they're not going to be able to run the boiler. So you run into some cost effectiveness issues if you're going to force them to put on very expensive controls that are only going to be in operation for 5 or 10 years.
But those
there's other
control units could theoretically be sold on the market afterwards.
Potentially, but I think it's more that they're some large units, they're very unique, and there might be some more creative solutions than just trying to squeeze them from 25 to 20 ppm.
Right.
Some of the key issues that you might hear when we bring this item are somewhat similar to 1135 in the overarching reclaim transition. One being that we should hear less of it for this rule in regards to the issue of barked and replacement, because we're talking about burner replacement, not unit replacement. The cost effectiveness is based on burner replacement. And then may hear some, comments in regards to the piecemealing issue, which we think is again a lesser issue that should be brought up with this particular rule. And then there's been some comments in regards to the availability of burners. We've provided information and source tests and to demonstrate that it is available and with the number of vendors and the details associated with that. So we're hoping that those issues will diminish.
And that'll be your presentation.
Yep.
Well, there's no presentation, we're just setting hearing, so,
Oh, that's right, it's just sitting here.
but you'll see it in the package. Any other questions on 1146? Okay, moving on page 3, it's Matt, item 3.
Yes, I got the next 3 items. The first one is to co-fund with the MSRC and the California Energy Commission the expansion of the UC Irvine hydrogen fueling station. So that station we originally funded, if you can believe it, over a decade ago. It's gone through a couple expansions. It's currently the highest utilized hydrogen station in all of the California network. So they've got 2 buses and then a whole bunch of cars that visit there. So we're asking the board to co-fund it with energy to expand there to accept larger amounts of liquid hydrogen. Any questions on that one? Okay, number 4, this is a really exciting project to develop and demonstrate zero-emission heavy-duty trucks. So this is a recent preliminary work from the California Air Resources Board under the ZANZAC program, which is zero and near zero emission freight facilities. But we're partnering with Volvo Trucks North America, second largest truck manufacturer in the world, to develop and then commercialize heavy-duty trucks. It also includes, as part of that demonstration of charging infrastructure, as well as off-road electric vehicles, and also freight facility upgrades like PV incorporated with the battery storage to charge the vehicles. I just want to highlight, this is, Sam and I were arguing about whether this is the largest project we've ever been awarded or the second largest, but in any case, it's in the top 5. The other big award was the Department of Energy's Recovery Act project we won about 7 years ago. But this is really exciting because it's a sister project to the Daimler Trucks North America Zero Emission Truck Project we came to board a couple months ago.
Something, old JB Hunt thing that fell through and then it went to the UPS or something?
That was part of the Recovery Act program, yeah. We weren't involved with that one, no. The final one that I'll present on is another kind of innovative program where we're working with EPA Region 9 as well as Region 10, I think it is, for Washington State, is that what you said? Region 10, yeah. But also working with Puget Sound. So what the idea is do a 2-way trade. We would trade out what we consider old vehicles here in the basin, so 2012 or newer, which have the 0.2 gram NOx standard. We would then trade those up to Washington, which doesn't have an attainment problem, but they could still use, there's still a useful life in the vehicles. And then they would get rid of much older vehicles, like 2005 and older. And so they're getting a benefit. They're also paying for up to $30,000 for that truck, so the original owner gets a benefit. And then we give them an incentive to get to the near zero 0.02 gram limit. So EPA is working with us to pilot this program. It's never been done. To see if, how successful it could be and whether it would serve as a model for getting rid of more older trucks in the region. So even though it's $1 million program, it's a modest 10 trucks, it's really a pilot to see if it'll work. So if you have to answer the questions. This is the Diesel Emission Reduction Act grant. And then Fred will present on the next 2 items.
The next one is the VW beneficiary plan under the VW Mitigation Trust. That fund has been allocated under this trust to Air Resources Board. Back in May, Air Resources Board approved 5 project categories to implement this beneficiary plan. It's for $360 million from the total of $423 million that has been allocated to ARB. We have been allocated 2 of these project categories for a total of $150 million, $90 million for zero emission Class 8 trucks and 4th grade trucks. And the other one is the no NOx combustion category and marine category for
for $60 million. So in this board letter, we are asking the board to approve establishment of a new fund to place this $150 million there, and also authorize the executive officer to execute grant agreements with Air Resources Board for these two project categories, and also enter into memorandum of agreement with San Joaquin Valley and Bay Area air districts, if necessary, to implement these projects, because they have to be implemented statewide. Any questions on this item?
What type of emissions are we looking for?
The entire program is looking for 10,000 tons of NOx emission reduction during a 10-year program. So Air Resources Board has estimated if these projects are implemented with the fundings allocated for each category, that would be achieved.
Is that for the entire program or just
Yes,
for us?
the entire program,
Not just for us?
not just for us.
Does the district have any discretion on the spending of these funds?
We are working with the Air Resources Board, that's in the grant agreement. Basically, these projects are statewide. So for example, San Joaquin gets the zero emission school bus and transit buses. So we're gonna do the outreach within our basin to encourage schools to apply for that program. We do the outreach here for our project categories, and basically one of the categories, which is the 90 million zero emission, that has to be on a first come first served basis. The other one on a solicitation basis and cost effectiveness. So ARB is going to set up the guidelines, how we select the projects and how much we allocate to project.
Are you referring to the distribution between the different funds, the different categories?
No, is it technology neutral between zero emission technologies?
In the separate categories, as Fred just
Yes.
mentioned, they're gonna set up the guidelines, but so, for example, some of the categories are strictly zero emission drayage trucks.
Right.
They can be fuel cell, they can be battery electric, as long as it's zero emission.
Okay, good, thanks.
Answers my question. Are there promising fuel cell? Are there promising fuel cell Class A trucks? Or is it mostly battery electric?
It depends on the duty cycle, but ARB, along with the preliminary award, we just won with Volvo, they also awarded the Port of LA to work with, they had proposed to work with Kenworth and Toyota on their fuel cell truck program. So that was another exciting development. We're going to come to the board to co-fund that program as well. And then we have, under our DOE program, 2 different fuel cell truck projects that are currently underway. So the trick is to get the cost down, right? They're very expensive components. And Toyota sees a pathway that by selling a whole bunch of light duty vehicles, that brings the whole supply chain cost down. So there's a potential for them doing bigger format vehicles. So the answer is yes.
Very cool. Just pricey.
So the next item is our 20th year Carl Moyer Program awards, and also the remaining balance of funds we have on the Community Air Protection Program under with AB 134 funds. And this year, in addition to that, we were allocated a couple of other funding sources from ARB, such as the Farmer and State Reserve Fund and so on. Altogether, we have close to $64 million available, which is quite a high number for Moyer projects. This year, we were oversubscribed by about 4 times of the funding we had. So the way we have evaluated projects are that we identified only projects that are in disadvantaged community and disadvantaged and low-income communities. So 100% of the projects that are recommended here are located in disadvantaged communities. The programs themselves, Carl Moyer has a goal of just meeting 50% in disadvantaged communities, and the AB 134 program has a requirement of 80%. So by meeting 100% in both categories, we are exceeding by far what ARB's minimum requirements are. In addition, because we were oversubscribed, we have a backup list of almost equal amount, another $64 million that can either be used for any projects that do not move forward, or for this current year that there's $245 million allocated, again, for the Community Air Protection Fund. Once we get our allocation, so these projects are ready to go for next year's funding. So this program basically asks for approval of these projects for year 20 more program. Any questions?
I have a question for you, Fred. Is this truly your last board assistance briefing meeting before you retire?
Sorry?
Is this your last
Yes.
board assistance
wow.
meeting?
Yes, I'll be retiring on November 16th after
Wow.
31 and a half years.
Oh, my
How much money have you given away in those 31 years?
About $1.5 billion is 20 years under different programs.
Wow.
That's a big number. And look how much clean air has resulted from
We
that.
started,
It's
the
more
first year,
impressive.
we started like with $5 to $10 million a year, and the last 10 years, we have consistently been doing close to $150 million.
So is it fair to say that you've cleaned up more air than anybody else?
Okay, thanks, Fred. Any other questions on page 5? So page 6, item 8, Joe King.
So this item is to release the request for proposal for the health study, for the $1 million health study, using the funds from the SoCal gas settlement. There has been a significant amount of outreach that has taken place over the last 10 months or so, including convening a health study technical advisory group, which consists of scientists and other folks from other agencies, 2 faculty members from universities who have relevant expertise, as well as 2 community members who were selected by the Porter Ranch Neighborhood Council. It also included conducting presentations at public meetings, allowing folks to provide input via email. So we really tried to incorporate as much of this input as we could. I think the other kind of key piece of this is that recently in August, the state, county, and city reached a settlement with SoCal Gas that provided $25 million to the county to conduct a health study. So we definitely want to make sure that we're not duplicating any work, and that because our piece is going first, theirs is actually still pending court approval. Because our piece is going first, we want to make sure that the portion that we're funding is the part that makes sense to go first, that will help inform the work that they do in their $25 million health study.
Any questions?
Is this piggybacking on any currently funded studies, or this is just a single piece of a project you guys envision?
So I'm not aware that we have any currently funded studies on this topic at this time. However, one component of this work that is being proposed in this RFP is the data integration portion. So we know that there has been a lot of data collected by our agency and others. There has been some dispersion modeling work, some limited dispersion modeling work done by UCLA that was funded by LA County. And I think there were some community concerns that they wanted to make sure that we were not duplicating that work. If those results are available, absolutely, that should be part of this data integration that we use as essential background information to inform a more comprehensive exposure model that we can develop here.
So what's this going to look like? Surveys, or, I mean, what exactly are you looking at? How do you gather data?
Right. So a lot of this, because of the $1 million budget here, a lot of this is really going to be utilizing data that has already been gathered. Again, not just by our agency, but by other agencies. A lot of this includes air pollution monitoring data, some of the air pollution modeling data, as I mentioned. If those results are available. Last time I spoke to Public Health, they indicated that those results should be available relatively soon. There's also complaints data, health complaints data, and other sources of information that are available. $1 million is not a whole lot of money to go and conduct primary data collection. We envisioned that a lot of primary data collection would be part of the $25 million health study conducted through public health, but of course they're still in the very, very early stages of figuring out how best to use that money. For this work, we're really looking at developing an exposure model, right, which is the necessary and critical first piece of any human health study of environmental exposures. So the result of this work would, the main result of this work would be an exposure model to tell you what pollutants, how much, how long, and what concentrations, and within what locations. So that is really the piece. And for any of us who have worked in environmental epidemiology, we know that this is a really critical, time-consuming, very laborious piece of the work.
So it's more putting existing data together and interpreting than doing original.
No, it's going to need to develop new models of exposure. It's a very complicated modeling exercise for an event like this. It's not something you could just run through our typical air mod off the shelf. It's more complicated. So I think that's why it's still going to be $1 million. A lot of it's to integrate the data, but a lot of it's to develop the methods and get the results of how we're going to get our best estimate possible. It's not going to be perfect of what people were exposed to, when, and for how long.
And sorry, one more piece. So, we do allow in the RFP that they could do some additional data collection. For example, I think there have been a lot of comments in terms of the very complex meteorology that exists in that area with the canyons and the channeling and so on. And as I understand it, there was fairly limited meteorological data that was existing for that very, very local area. So, using a weather station that is, miles away, may not be the best to inform this very localized meteorological conditions.
How many years is this project? How many years is it?
How many years for this particular study? So I think we're envisioning probably 1 to 2 year time.
Because I back in the day, the old Omnitrans stank, I don't even know if you were around back then, no pun intended, honestly. But what are the health effects of methane? What are the concerns that?
Methane itself is pretty well known. The only health effect of methane is if it displaces enough oxygen.
And you die.
And you die. So that's in the percent, that's in that's in percent level.
You get complaints for nosebleeds, nausea, headaches.
Yeah, so the question is what was coming out of the well in addition to methane, right? We know there's trace elements of VOCs. We know there was concerns about the kill mud that they put in, and that splattered out in a couple cases. And working through all that, there's a lot of data that's been collected in various places about the content of the gas and all that, and just putting it all together into one model to get that exposure map as best you can, and that can be used when they're looking at primary health data to see if that could be matched up in the kind of the traditional epidemiology sense.
So 1 million for 1 or 2 years sounds a lot.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
But again, even the data integration is going to take a lot of people. It's a lot of people. It's going to be more than one person sitting at a desk.
You mentioned this is a multidisciplinary teamwork.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think one of the concerns that we wanted to make sure was addressed through this RFP was the need for the community to have a voice in this and to be engaged. So there is a requirement for having an outreach plan as part of this work.
Yeah. I mean, the RFP goes out for $1 million. If somebody says they can do everything for less, we usually don't insist they take more. So.
Okay. The change orders will take care of that.
Any other questions? Okay, this next one, sorry, I'll just handle this quickly. If you watched Mobile Source or at Mobile Source, we gave a presentation on the recent ozone levels in recent years, its relation to meteorology and emissions and all the things that we continually look at. But one thing that came out of recent trends in ozone, which haven't been favorable, was that the weather patterns were not conducive to clean air over the last few years. So with this, we want to release an RFP to do a meteorological study to look at those weather patterns over the last 3 years, compare them to historical weather patterns, let us know whether this is really an anomaly that's or is kind of the new normal and expected to continue given what climate models predict. And if that is true, then we're going to have to look at how we adjust our strategies to handle potentially more frequent adverse weather that leads to poor air quality. So this is to help us do that kind of statistical meteorological assessment to see how unusual it has been and is it going to continue to be unusual and then not be unusual anymore.
So my understanding from the staff's presentation during the mobile source committee meeting is this is more exercise looking at historical data than trying to use climate model predict into the future, right?
Historical and then maybe short-term into the future,
Short-term in the
but
future,
not all
not long-term.
a lot of the other studies have looked into 2030, 2050 climate models predicting effects on air quality. And we have some shorter-term deadlines and plans we have to develop that need a closer look at our particular issues. And a closer look at the meteorology. A lot of those other climate models are very broader when it comes to predictions and weather patterns, and we have some very specific local weather patterns we need to assess.
One aspect that I think will be really helpful is for whoever did this RP and produced the report is to, let's say, tease out the meteorology impacts. What is the trend look like? Whether that match with your emission projection, your emission inventory trends, does that make sense?
Well, we tried in this case, at least we're trying in this case, to make it more of a meteorological study than an air quality study. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of modeling and air quality studies looking at emissions and trends in emissions and trends in air quality, redoing the modeling that we do internally. I don't want it to just be another one of those studies.
Sure.
I wanted to focus in on these weather patterns that we're seeing. Right?
But then there's also a piece about emission inventory also changes if you look at historically, right? I assume the staff will have to work closely with the team to provide that kind of information.
But again, I'm not. It's possible that we'll get into that depending on who the expertise of the person that applies. I wanted to make it so a meteorologist who didn't have air quality experience can look at this issue, not necessarily an air quality expert, because we're looking at the conditions meteorological conditions that lead to poor air quality. We can all define those and then look at those conditions rather than their effect on air quality, which could be a different study, and it's work we do all the time. But this is looking specifically at, are those inversion heights lower? Is it warmer?
Looking at like short-term when meteorology changes from on the orders of maybe days, weeks, and then how that
compares year to year
over the long term. Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
Those other things need to be done as well, and we do a lot of that internally, and we can work through working groups and technical groups to do that in our AQMP, and we do that all the time. But this is kind of a specific question we'd like to dive into.
Sounds like you need to bring somebody out of retirement.
There's lots of local local people who can do this very well in JPL, at UCLA, even outside the basin at NASA and Weather
we
Service.
had a former employee that was an expert meteorologist and also had a lot of expertise in modeling.
Yeah, if he wants to apply. But I mean, we have a lot of this expertise in-house, but we wanted this independent look.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Do we have a very deep bench as we once had in-house to be able to do that?
Internally? Yes, and getting deeper every day. We're about to hire 2 to 4 new, 3 to 5 new, pure air quality modeler analysis type people, all PhDs and postdocs. I just met with staff on the list. It's pretty impressive what we're going to get.
Is staff looking at the NO versus NO2, what's going on with them over the last few years? I looked at San Bernardino. I was looking at the high NO and NO2 levels per day, and I'm very good at adding up. And I look at May through September for 2017, 2004, and compare it. And the NO2, NO levels have dropped significantly more quickly than the NO2, a greater disparity. And NO, in my sense, is the Pac-Man in regard to ozone. Is that correct? Basically?
It's a little more complicated, and
Probably is,
because
but-
of some of that variability, we tend to look at NOx as a whole, because it's a little more stable, a metric, and you don't have to get into that difference.
Okay.
But there are differences, right? So number one, NO2 is a pollutant, while NO is not, right? And there are some effects of NO2 and NO and ozone formation. Let's saying me weigh in here, but I'm not sure we're seeing that effect. I think it's more of a local effect sometimes, those NO, NO2 ratios, because once the NO is emitted in the atmosphere, it converts pretty quickly, and the ratio is really dependent on some atmospheric factors more than emission factors, but I'll let Sang-Mi add to that.
Oh, well,
Sorry.
yes, Dr. Fine pretty much touched base the basics of it, but then one of the factors is NO is mostly the form of the emission. So any exhaust coming out of vehicle is primarily a form of NO. And then in the atmosphere during underchemistry, it transforms to NO2. But then the ratio or concentration of NO and NO2 is also a function of ozone concentration. And then historically we have, compared to 10 years ago, the ozone level is much lower here. So basically balance between NO and ozone and NO2 possibly shifts.
Okay, well, the areas I looked at is the smog belt. And I could consider the smog belt primarily being those areas along the foothills. And the increase we've seen in exceeding the federal 0.07 standard is in those areas. Most of the other areas in the district have seen a reduction. Those areas have seen an increase, like San Gabriel, Reseda, Santa Clarita.
In ozone or in NO?
No, in ozone.
In ozone.
In ozone. And the only thing I can look at is that they've had a significant reduction in NO, which I'm being simplistic, and you guys know far more than I do, but I'm just thinking there intuitively that maybe there's some sort of relationship there, that as you drop as the NO levels decrease, I'm looking at the peak per day, I think there may be some relationship there.
Yeah.
What do I know? I know nothing, but I'm seeing that, and in other areas, it's not as obvious as in the small area.
Well, we can look into that, but again, it's kind of this cycle. So it's the NO/NO2 ratio controls ozone, but you can also think of it as the ozone levels control the NO/NO2 ratio. So it's this equilibrium that's reached, and it depends on sunlight and temperature and other things. So it's complicated, but we can take a look.
In San Bernardino, the San Bernardino station, the NO2, the peak was like 2/3 of the NOx, the peak reading. And then during the afternoon, when you have the ozone buildup, NO drops almost down to 0. So.
Well, that's what's supposed to happen.
Well, but it's much lower now than it used to be.
Okay.
That's all.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that. Any other questions on this? Okay, Derek, are you still here?
So this item is just to extend our existing contract with our 3 consultants up in Sacramento for another year. This is the first extension of 2 possible, or 1 other possible extension.
Any questions? Hearing none. Bay, are you next?
Yep. So this item is just to recognize revenue and execute contracts for the installation and maintenance of air filtration systems relating to a settlement agreement that we reached with Rainbow Transfer. And it's basically to install and maintain some air filtration systems at schools in the local school district in Huntington Beach. Any questions on that?
Why only 5 years maintenance?
That would probably, do you know, Matt?
Just the amount of funding allowed.
Yeah.
So is that something we're gonna keep an eye on for potential other funds in the future?
Yeah, and we've done that in the past with Boyle Heights. So
Okay.
it was resurrection, we put in air filters and then we got subsequent steps, we just did replacements.
Okay.
Other entities have stepped up to do some of the maintenance as well.
That's the hope.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Thanks, Mark.
Next
Okay.
item is just the annual or the monthly MSRC contracts are awarded every day that entity, so we just administer the contracts for them. We're doing a couple, under their work program, we're doing some electric vehicle charging, natural gas infrastructure, and some vehicle replacements.
Like what, $40 million to go in the next 2 years, something like that? Is what the number was? I missed the retreat earlier this week. So for all you local government types, there's a ton of money out there for fleets and stuff.
Any questions on that? Okay. So the next item, as we do every year, we're looking at the board calendar for next year, looking at, oh, this is the meeting schedule, I'm sorry. I thought I was reading rule calendar, which we're also working on for December. Okay.
No, good.
But Wayne's not here. So this is just a board meeting schedule. I think the only deviation from the norm is potentially taking the July 5th meeting and moving it a week later, because we figure we're not going to get a lot of participation the day after the holiday. So I think everything else is standard, right? Any questions on the reports 14 through 20?
I am not gonna ask about the rule forecast.
So December will come with our annual rule forecast, so we're working on that now.
And that's a statutory thing, really.
Yeah. Okay, the board calendar, so 21 through 25, any questions on that, or 26? All right, hearing none.
We have a.
Oh, sorry.
You go.
Got a question that, is there a possibility that we can have a board assistance briefing on the 29th of November?
Was that the 29th? Is that the
Yeah, that's
Oh, next month.
next month. Did I say December?
No, you
No, you said
Okay.
November.
I said November, because we don't have one on the schedule currently, and
I thought we did schedule
Oh.
for Thanksgiving.
We should be
did we,
there.
Nancy?
No, the last 2 months, we don't have meetings generally because there's holidays.
There's
But
no
we
board
did,
There is,
discussion.
is it? Because I don't have, yeah.
No.
so-
December 7th is a board meeting, but we normally don't schedule November.
Yes,
Oh,
because
yeah.
typically
Give me an
Thanksgiving falls
excuse to
on the
postpone a
Thursday
dentist
before.
appointment.
No.
Oh, that
This
was
year,
before.
Oh,
Thanksgiving.
also,
Yeah.
January 24th is not the last Friday.
Okay.
January 24th
Is not the last Friday,
So we didn't check that date?
yeah.
Okay.
Do the 31st.
Yeah,
Right.
so it just helps me to get better prepared for the board hearing on December 7th.
But one year, we did add a meeting for November, I think it was like on a Tuesday or something. We did
Yeah, I
do it one
remember
year, it was either last year or the year before. So
Thanksgiving falls on the 22nd this year.
Right,
so
Which
right.
means the 29th, which is the last Thursday of November.
Which
is
would
a
actually be a
free day.
normally scheduled
Right.
board meeting if it wasn't for.
Okay, we'll look
So,
into it and let
Can
you
we look
know.
into that?
I agree.
To do the 29th.
Yeah.
Okay.
29th.
We'll let you all
Volunteering to
know.
go to an extra meeting is one.
Okay, everyone's running away, we're not done.
We have,
We're not done.
we have one public commenter.
Well, we're still on item 1, so comment on item 1, which is the agenda. Right.
Yeah.
Thanks, sir.
So you can go in at 14:07 if you want.
Okay,
Well-
we have to start this.
Okay,
Paul,
good morning, afternoon. Peter Whittingham with Whittingham Public Affairs Advisors. I was listening to the meeting on my way here. Despite my best efforts, I missed the conclusion of 1407.1 discussion, and so, Bay advised, and so as to avoid his pulling the plug on me, I'll try to keep the comments general here.
To clarify, since item number 1 was review of the agenda.
Sure.
And we just finished talking about item number 1, this is public comment
Okay.
essentially on.
I'll skate
item
up to the
number one.
line and see if I.
No, you're fine.
Okay, all right.
You're fine.
if some of you don't know, I've been attending board assistant briefings for about the last 25 years. Certainly before there was a podium and a velvet rope, I felt like I was waiting in line at a club that my daughter dragged me to that I wouldn't enjoy being in. But and certainly to Ruth Ann's comments, and Ruth Ann was a board assistant with me back in the day. For 5 years I was a board assistant. These are great opportunities to see an advanced glimpse at the board agenda for the following week. Certainly ask specific types of questions of folks like Fred. And my gosh, congratulations to him. But as you can tell from this briefing and others, it's not a meeting unlike the board committees where you get a robust attendance from either industry or environmentalists or others other than candidly district staff. And so to that end, somewhat of a concern as I was listening on the way here about points of contention and how they're I guess presented and colored. So, for example, on 1407.1, the discussion earlier, a few comments were made, and I think I wanted to address them real briefly here. One, the Cal Poly Pomona study. Cal Poly Pomona has metallurgists and a facility with expertise and equipment to replicate the various processes and specific techniques that are used at the variety of facilities that would be subject to 1407.1. Phil mentioned Susan mentioned 8 facilities that would be small source tested, and that was a small sample of the universe for this rule. But actually, for the 1407.1, there would only be at most 13 facilities of the 1,100 that are in the South Coast Basin that do metal work. Just about 13 would be subject to 1407.1. So 8 is more than actually half. And one of the concerns that has been expressed is how to do the testing in a way that is very specific. And at the Stationary Source Committee meeting, the professor from Cal Poly Pomona was here and actually said that testing could be done in a month, replicating the various processes that are used at the various facilities. Phil mentioned delay tactic. This is absolutely not a delay tactic. What we want to do is make sure that the information that is gathered is most beneficial to a potential rule if there is a rule to be developed. So I think I won't go into the comments that were shared in comment letters or at working group meetings, but perhaps in the future those can be shared as well. So thank you so much for listening.
At the risk of going too long, I just want to respond to one thing. I know they testified that it was a month. We are trying to get it done as soon as possible. Contract negotiations, it's not 1 month. I can promise you. It's taken a month to even get to the point where we have a statement of work and are working through some of the issues. So maybe it could be done quicker than 6 months if we're trying, but it's already, 1 month was very aggressive. Okay. Any other questions from anyone? Other business? Anyone on the group have anything else they want to bring up?
Just one comment. Mojave Desert SCAQMD is sponsoring the California Desert Air Working Group Conference in Laughlin the first week in November. It's a really good conference. I think Lockheed's going to present. Yep. So anyway, just FYI, it's a really good conference. It always is. So.
Okay. Any general public comment on things not on the agenda? Okay, with that, we'll adjourn the meeting to potentially next month, 29th, but not for sure yet.
Yeah, maybe.
Thanks for doing that. It does
So
help.
we have